I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a poll conducted by the Brookings Institute regarding American attitudes towards the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Brookings poll was sponsored by the Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and questioned roughly 1,000 American adults. Now, the way the poll is being portrayed in the media, it supposedly shows that a plurality of Democrats and more than a third of all American voters favor U.S. sanctions against Israel because of Israel's ongoing settlement policy. But how objective is the Brookings poll? And does it prejudice the results in the way it frames the question? Well, one journalist who has serious questions about the way Brookings might be stacking the deck against Israel, by the way it poses its questions in a very unusual way, is Ron Kampeas, the Washington correspondent for the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, who joins us now from Washington, D.C. And Ron, thank you so much for joining us again here on JBS.
Oh, no, it's great to be here.
Ron, first explain why you feel the Brookings Institute biased its question about American attitudes towards settlement policy of Israel.
Well, the way it sets up the question is that the whole settlement enterprise is framed in very negative terms. And, you can believe what you want about settlements, but it doesn't make it for good polling when you kind of push poll. So they talk about how every administration, Republican and Democrat, has opposed settlements. They talk about how virtually every country in the world regards them as illegal. And then they just simply say that Israel defends its settlements. It doesn't say why Israel defends its settlements. It doesn't say, for instance, it doesn't talk about the ancient Jewish history in that part of in the West Bank, in the parts of the West Bank where Jews are settled. And it casts the settlements implicitly as the only obstacle to peace, whereas Israeli leaders would say that the obstacle to peace lies more with the Palestinians and their recalcitrance. So it sets it up for just a negative answer.
Yes. Ron, I want to show our viewers the actual way the question was posed, and then I want to ask you to comment on some of the lines inside the question. Okay. Here's what the question reads. One of the issues of tension between the United States and Israel has been its construction of Israeli settlements in the territories occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. These settlements, and Ron, here's where I want you to comment. You've already begun to do so, but these settlements are considered illegal by most of the international community and have been opposed by every U.S. administration, both Republican and Democrat. Talk about that for 1 second, Ron. To what extent has every U.S. administration opposed Israeli settlements?
Yeah, that's true. It actually takes some nuance out of it. First of all, there are some administrations, like the Ford and Carter administrations and the Obama administrations, that have called them illegal, and some have said that they simply don't favor them. They don't call them illegal.
Exactly.
And secondly, you're missing like the big nuance that actually not just George W. Bush but Obama has embraced of accepting that some of the settlements, certain settlement blocks, are likely to remain part of Israel as part of any final status agreement. And so that's also missing from there. So there are settlements and there are settlements.
Yes. And I want to make sure people understand you. Not every American administration has called Israeli settlements illegal, correct?
You're correct. Absolutely. Starting with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, his administration explicitly said that they could not determine whether they were illegal or not. But they did oppose them.
Yes.
That's for sure. Yeah.
I understand, Bowie. It is true that American administrations have opposed settlements, but it is incorrect to say that settlements are across the board viewed as illegal. And there are many people, Ron, who argue effectively that the Israeli settlements may not be wise, but they are not illegal, correct?
That's correct, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Then the question goes on to say, the Israeli government has continued to build settlements, arguing that they have the right to do so, or that, I believe they meant to say, and that, these are not obstacles to peace. So I want to break that down into two questions for you, Ron. The Israeli government has continued to build settlements. Has the Netanyahu government built new Israeli settlements?
No, it hasn't. It has approved the expansion of existing settlements. It's allowed certain illegal outposts to gain legal status, but it hasn't initiated new settlements per se. But the problem with that question is like arguing that it has the right to do so. That's meaningless. Obviously, if it's doing something, the government feels it has the right to do so. Tell them why it feels it has the right to do so.
Right. Most of this settlement construction in the last number of years has been what's been called vertical as opposed to horizontal, meaning it's construction within existing settlements, especially settlements, as you point out, and you understand, Ron, the word settlements in and of itself is a very misleading term. These are communities, and most of the settlement building has been inside communities. It has not been extending the borders or creating new settlements, correct?
Yeah, correct. Like I said, part of the problem is that there are so-called illegal outposts that haven't been removed, that have gained a certain foothold, can be said to be established now. But those haven't been the initiative of the government per se. And like you say, most of the building that the successive administrations have objected to has been vertical, so to speak, been within the existing settlements.
And again, what I understand to be true, and you tell me whether you think I've got it right, there is a constant tension between those who in Israel would like to extend settlements and build new settlements, new outposts, and the Netanyahu government, which tries as much as it can to remove and to take down settlements which Israel itself defines as illegal, and that in most instances, the Netanyahu government is dismantling any illegal settlement building. Do I have it correct?
Yeah, there is this sort of dance where like it gets dismantled, it gets rebuilt, it gets dismantled, it gets rebuilt. But yeah, I mean, broadly you have it correct. The Netanyahu government has been careful not to want to harm its relationship with the international community, to inhibit the return to peace talks, and they have tried to inhibit that kind of so-called illegal settlement construction.
Okay, and then I want to read the very last sentence and have you comment on it, because in some way your column that you wrote on this Brookings poll, I don't know whether you focus on the very last sentence. The question that is then asked of the respondents is, how do you believe the U.S. should react to new settlements? The question is specifically about new settlements, Ron. It's not about settlements in general. Your comment.
Yeah, exactly. I did notice that as well, and I forgot to include it. But yes, here you are setting up a question about existing settlements, and then suddenly you're going to new settlements without suggesting that Israel is building new settlements.
Yes.
It's kind of a non sequitur.
Yes. Anyway, I was so pleased with your piece, and it was a bit of a courageous stand you took, and I applaud you for it, and I'm glad I got to be able to say this to you on JBS. The respondents are then given three options. The U.S., in light of all this, should do nothing. The U.S. should limit itself to opposing in words, but take no other action. 3, it should impose economic sanctions, either through the United Nations or unilaterally, or it should take more serious action. And what are the results of the poll show, Ron?
They show that 49% of Democrats believe that the U.S. should do one of the latter two options. And again, even the way those are set up, those are geared towards a negative action. Because if you look at number 3 or C, that's the most detailed and easy to grasp onto answer. So you think in your head number C, and there should be an actual E. There should be a fifth option. The U.S. should embrace settlement.
Of course.
Not that I'm not endorsing that.
I
saying
understand.
If if you're going to ask Americans to react, and in the comments, in the back and forth, somebody asked, "Oh, why shouldn't this question be phrased this way?" And I said, it's not because I believe in one thing or another. It's because if this thing ever does come to a political battle in the United States, the Israeli consulates and embassies, the pro-Israel community is going to put out arguments that Americans are going to be absorbing, and this question doesn't take that into account. So we can't. It's not a good metric. We don't know from this how Americans are truly going to react to the whole settlement question, should it ever come to that.
What's your understanding in general, Ron, of the orientation of the Brookings Institute? Where do they stand on the political spectrum?
They are, they would be considered liberal hawks. I think they're they're liberal. They're mostly Democratic. This was specifically run for the center. Their Middle East center, and the people who run it, they're very good people. I like them a lot. Martin Indyk and Tamara Coffin-Wittis, but they're both veterans of the Obama administration. They're both people who come out of Democratic administrations. And this particular poll was run by a guy at the University of Maryland, Shibli Telhami, who has been critical of Israeli policy. And it's just a shame, because we could learn a lot from a poll like this. In the end, I started off this item saying this is why my headline will not be about the settlements. In the end, the only useful thing about the poll came in terms of approval ratings for Netanyahu, because that was a question that was asked in a straightforward way at the beginning of the poll. So whoever was answering the question hadn't been set up for bias. Otherwise, the poll is useless. Why spend all this? Costs a lot of money to phone 1,000 people and get their answers.
Okay.
Why spend all that money if you're going to throw it away?
Yes, but in essence, and I thought this was what your column was basically suggesting in a very subtle way, was that there was an agenda behind this poll, and the agenda was to, in some way, a little bit slam Israel. And that's the sense I got, especially from, this is question, I think, 43. Yeah, question 43. And that's also why I wanted you to identify the Brookings Institute, which has an excellent reputation, has some excellent people, but they do have a bias of their own when they talk about or do work relating to the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, correct?
Correct, yeah. I mean, I would say, they just finished running the Saban Center, which is sponsored by Chaim Saban. Their people there are tremendously close to Israelis, certainly more Israelis more on one side of the spectrum than the other, but you had Likud ministers coming to this, Moshe Ya'alon coming, so they have friendly, warm relations.
Absolutely.
But yes, they have an outlook. They
Yes.
definitely have an outlook on the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right. Take another moment with me to look at another part of the poll. The poll here shows that while the number of Americans who want the U.S. government to push for a two-state solution held constant at 39%, but that there was an increase in the number of Americans who now want the U.S. administration to push for a one binational state where there would be Jews and Palestinians with equal citizenship, which of course would put an end to the Jewish state of Israel. Last year, only 24% of Americans supported the idea of one binational state. That number, according to this poll, has increased to 34%. And when asked what they would prefer if a two-state solution is not possible, more than 65%, two-thirds of those polled, Ron, said they would support the creation of one binational state. What's your sense of that question and the results that come out of it?
Again, I think it's it's a question that's underpinned by a lot of pessimism. There's a lot of pessimistic assumptions underneath it. There's an assumption that there's no willingness on either side to advance towards some kind of equitable separation. I think that there's also difficulties, and this poll is like those kinds of questions are geared for a "shall we wash our hands of this" type of thing question, and I don't think it's almost not worth asking, because there's no administration that is going to wash its hands of this whole situation.
Of course. By the way, it's very hard for most people I talk to now, Ron, across the political spectrum, to believe there is a Palestinian leadership at the moment which would really endorse publicly a two-state solution that that acknowledged the second state would be a legitimate Jewish state. At the moment, when you talk to people, you talk to people all the time in Washington, you talk to anybody who says there is a Palestinian leadership that would accept a Jewish state and the legitimacy of that Jewish state and would renounce a right of return and put an end to all claims. Anybody saying that these days?
To a degree. I mean, I think there are people who believe that Mahmoud Abbas would be who's a relatively weak leader and is like somebody who follows public opinion rather than leads it. But they think that he would be committed to that. He famously said that I'm from Safed, I don't need to return to Safed. So there is that. The whole evolution of the Jewish state thing is just, it speaks to how bad relations have become since the Second Intifada between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because you can identify points in the 90s and the early 2000s where Yasser Arafat talks about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. There was no problem with it then. And I think because of the intensity of the Second Intifada and the breadth of what was perceived as the depth of Palestinian hatred towards Israel, there was an incipient questioning on the Israelis' part. And remember, this is not Netanyahu. The first person who came up with this again in its modern iteration was Tzipi Livni, and simply saying, maybe we need you to recommit to the idea that this is a Jewish state. Except things were so bad at that point, and they've become worse since, that the Palestinians say, hey, wait a second, you want this from us? Well, we're not going to give it to you unless blah, 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 blah. And so that's where things are now. Okay, there are many people who tell me that Abbas has never said that he would endorse a Jewish state. He has said he accepts the notion of two states, but he will never call it a Jewish state, nor is he willing to give up a right of return, nor is he willing to say that he is ready to give up all claims against the state of Israel. So I'm surprised you've heard people today say they think Mahmoud Abbas is willing to make that kind of statement publicly. And as far as I know, Ron, he has not made that statement. No, he's not. That's what I'm saying. At this point, not since, like I said, the days of Arafat, has any Palestinian leader recognized Israel as a Jewish state, for sure. And why? Why do you understand Arafat walked away from the 2000 Camp David when both Clinton and Barack thought there was a deal on the table where the Palestinians would get virtually 95% of the West Bank? And all Arafat would have to say was, yes, it's a Jewish state and we give up the right of return. Why did Arafat in 2000, from your perspective, walk away from that deal? I don't think he was a leader. I think he was scared. I think that, and this is it speaks to the broader problem with between Israel and the Arab world. Because if you remember after, one of the interesting things is that immediately after that, Camp David, when the negotiators came back, I spoke to the Israelis and I spoke to the Palestinians, who were, not all of them, but I spoke to 2 or 3 of them who had been at the table, including Saeb Erekat. And the Palestinians were convinced that they were going to get things back on track, that everything was going to be fine. And then what happened is that Arafat, did his sort of world tour and said, if I make these concessions, will you back me? He went to Saudi Arabia, he went to major Muslim nations, and of course the principal concession that he needed to extract from them that they would back him was sharing Jerusalem, having some sort of Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem as well as Palestinian sovereignty in Jerusalem. And he didn't get that. They basically told him, you're on your own. You're on your own. And I think that spooked him. He didn't know what to do after that. He knew that he would be, Arafat, for all his having been, the symbol of the Palestinian liberation movement, was missing something as a leader, to put it mildly. Okay. The question I felt that was most telling, Ron, was the one that indicates how strongly Americans feel the U.S. should or should not lean towards Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of Americans as a whole, Ron, the Brookings poll showed 55% of Americans want the United States to lean towards Israel. Now, it's a majority, but 55% does not impress me. Among Democrats, only 30% of Democrats
said the U.S. should tilt towards Israel. 57% of Democrats said the U.S. should take no side whatsoever. And 13% of Democrats said that the U.S. should tilt towards Palestinians. To me, that was a very significant finding. What's your sense?
No, I think that that's certainly consistent with what's been happening in recent years. I think it was exacerbated by the tensions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama over the last year. Like I said, the thing that I took away from this is that Netanyahu's disapproval ratings, I think, climbed from 22 to 34% among Democrats, and I think that those tensions over the year contributed to that. And I think also, I mean, part of it must be said also that since the 90s, you've had this mantra, and it's been kind of silent now, but I think it still exists in a subterranean way, is that you can be pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. And so in that sense, there are going to be people who are answering that question who are going to be thinking, well, yeah, why can't they lean towards both sides, so to speak? Why should they lean to one side towards the other? Especially if, like, the two governments at least aren't at war, and you have the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority still cooperating on a lot of levels. So I think those two things would explain that.
Okay. I want to ask you one more question while I have you. You know, the Republican candidates, appeared before the Republican Jewish Coalition recently, and boy, a lot of fire came out of that meeting. Donald Trump seemed to ruffle a lot of Jewish feathers, and today Mayor de Blasio of New York criticized Trump for hateful, shameful, anti-Semitic stereotypes because Trump, indicated Jews like to negotiate and Jews are thrifty. What do you hear coming out of the Republican Jewish Coalition and, Trump, as well as Rubio and Santorum and the apocalyptic threat from Islam? But, give us just your sense of what came out of that meeting.
I think that regarding Trump particularly and his statements, I wasn't in the room. I couldn't attend. I was out of town that day. But first of all, he was looking at particular people. I think that Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League had the most, probably the most accurate take in that he was talking. He didn't think himself as talking to Jews. He was talking to a room full of people, many of whose faces he knew, because a lot of Republican Jews are from New York. They interact with Trump. So he says when he said, and he actually said at one point, and this was left out of a lot of the accounts, hey, I was where you were 5 months ago. And Trump wasn't saying I was Jewish or I was a Jewish stereotype 5 months ago. Trump was saying I was a rich guy who tried to buy politicians 5 months ago. That wasn't Trump's problem. I think Trump's problem was more that he wouldn't commit to a Israeli sovereignty over a united Jerusalem. That he
Yes.
wouldn't. That he also said that Israel was partly to blame for the.
Yes.
Those are the things I think that troubled the Republic. I mean, I spoke to the Republicans coming out of there. They thought that the other stuff was just funny. It shows how things can get distorted.
Okay, and you have put your finger on something that is so important to me. If our viewers right now, when they're not watching JBS or they're not reading you, Ron Kampeas, in the JTA, they should go online and Google the Republican National Coalition and the meeting that they had. And at the moment, all of the headlines on Google talk only about Trump's comments about how Jews related to money. And the one comment that troubled me the most, and I'm hoping that Mr. Trump comes on JBS and explains himself, was that, as you just said, Trump blamed Israel for the problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not Israel alone. But I was surprised to hear from Donald Trump, given everything he's saying about ISIS these days, everything he's saying about terrorism in general, I was really surprised to hear him sort of blame Israel for not doing enough for peace, as well as the issue over Jerusalem, which I personally feel is a much more complicated issue. But I don't feel there's any complication over the issue of why is there no peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And I'm wondering if you've heard other people talk about the extent to which this could hurt Trump, not only in the Jewish world, but in a larger sense. What are you hearing, Ron?
Oh, I'm saying, the Zionist Organization of America has already called him out for it. So yes, it's certainly, I think, in terms of natural Jewish constituencies among Republicans, per se, it's harmed him. He has no hope among Democratic voting Jews, I don't think, in any case, for a whole
Right,
bunch of other reasons. But
right.
certainly among Republicans, it would have harmed him. But I don't think he cares. I think, he is willing to challenge whatever, or to undercut whatever conventional wisdom he sees out there. And we'll see how it plays out in the caucuses and in the primaries. There are people who, no matter what he says, are going to vote for him, hell or high water. The question is whether he can actually accrue majorities. I don't know if he can do that, and I think certainly his whole Israel stance will contribute to that. But I don't think that's the only problem he has in terms of getting majorities. But or whether he's just going to be a spoiler, garnering maybe up to a third of the vote in every one of those caucuses and primaries, and taking this all the way to taking it all the way to the convention. So we don't know yet.
Yes, it could be a fascinating political story. As far as you know, did any one of the candidates do particularly well in front of the Republican Jewish coalition?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that I heard did well were Jeb Bush, who was very energetic and really well. And Jeb Bush has the backing of most Republican Jewish donors, and they're wondering why he's tanking. And he did, and the sentiment was if he only spoke on the field like he spoke here, he'd be doing a lot better. Marco Rubio, whose support among Republican Jews is growing, did very well, and so did Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is a little more divisive, though. They're just like within the broader Republican Party, among Jewish Republicans, there are people who really don't like him at all. Also because, interestingly, not at the RJC thing, but elsewhere, he's also sent out some signals that are a little bit disconcerting, talking about neoconservatives. And in a way, it's not wrong to criticize neoconservatives, but when you blame neocons for everything that's been bad happening to the America over the last 10, 15 years, you're kind of putting yourself into a camp that overlaps with a camp that's hostile to Jewish interests, I think, and that's at least a lot of Jewish Republicans believe that. So there's been real sharp criticism against him, more so than I've seen in a long, more outspoken than I've seen until now in terms of Cruz. But he got a good reception otherwise, because he is very pro-Israel, very anti-Iran deal, and that's just the crowd for this.
Yes. I want you to know I'm going to turn to you a lot as we head closer and closer into the political conventions and the presidential elections, both primaries and then the general elections heat up. You do fabulous work. Congratulations again on really calling out some important things on this Brookings Institute poll. You continue to do wonderful work, and I'm always so pleased to feature you on JBS. So you be well, and I'll talk to you again very, very soon, Ron.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. The analysis of Ron Kampeas, again, the Washington Bureau Chief for the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, explaining why he feels the Brookings Institute poll on Israel was in some way biased in the way it formulated its questions. And Ron reminds us that polls can often be extremely misleading and can in many ways be skewed to produce a predetermined result. So all of us have to be careful when we read a poll, even if it says something we like. And at the same time, while it's clear that a significant majority of Americans are extremely supportive of Israel, the Brookings poll does show that in certain specific areas, Americans in general, and Democrats in particular, are being swayed against Israel. And that's a troubling element that should be a concern to all of us. My thanks, as always, to Sloan Copeland, our director, Serge Goldberg, production coordinator, Dara Golub, JBS Associate Director, and to our producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.